The enchanted ceiling of the great hall had turned the color of ink. Not black exactly, more the deep September blue-black of a sky, still releasing its last light at the horizon, the early stars beginning their slow assertion where the clouds had thinned. Phileas Flitwick had eaten beneath that ceiling for more years than he cared to count, and still it surprised him that a charm so ambitious, so exquisitely calibrated to the actual sky overhead, should continue to perform so effortlessly, decade after decade, without a single visible seam. He had once spent 3 weeks attempting to deconstruct it purely as an academic exercise. He had given up before the first week was out. Some enchantments, he had concluded with a certain rueful respect, were better admired than taken apart. He settled himself more comfortably on the cushioned addition he had made to his bench, a small practical arrangement from several years back, before the dignity of it had ceased to matter, and observed. The first years had just been sorted. They were filing toward their respective tables now, some still pale from the hat's deliberation, others flushed with relief or bright-eyed with the particular giddiness of a good outcome. The Gryffindor table received its newest members with the enthusiasm that house reserved for everything, great volume, and very little ceremony. One boy was already attempting to eat a bread roll while being clapped on the back by someone 3 years his senior. Flitwick watched the older student's expression, the easy welcome of someone who had never had to wonder whether he belonged here, and thought of nothing in particular. He scanned the new faces methodically, as he always did on sorting evenings. 3 decades of teaching had convinced him that the very first night offered a kind of raw intelligence about who these children were before they learned to compose themselves into the versions they preferred to present. The frightened ones who sorted Gryffindor, the ones who sorted Slytherin before the hat had finished its deliberation. The dreamers who arrived in Ravenclaw carrying not quite intelligence, exactly, but a particular hunger that served the same purpose. He found the Potter boy without much difficulty. Harry Potter sat the way children sat when they had learned, early and thoroughly, to take up as little space as possible, reaching for the nearest thing on the table without fully looking at it, self-contained in the manner of someone for whom self-containment had been less a choice than a condition. Flitwick had taught enough children from difficult circumstances to recognize the posture in a moment. Watchful, careful, practicing with moderate success, not to look as though he was watching anything. Thin face, untidy black hair, round glasses a shade too large for his features, and on his forehead, half hidden by the fringe, the lightning bolt scar that everyone in Britain's wizarding world had known about for a decade without ever quite having to look at directly. He was still observing, purely as a matter of professional habit, he would have said, if anyone had asked, when the boy's hand moved to his forehead. Half a second, perhaps less. Harry Potter pressed his fingers briefly to the scar, and then dropped his hand, and the whole thing might have been nothing more than a child with an itch except for what Flitwick felt in the same moment. A pulse, sudden and sharp, of something old and durable being stressed from outside. Not pain. The sensation was not pain. It was closer to the sympathetic resonance of a struck string felt through the body of the instrument. An enchantment under tension. He did not move. He did not reach for his water. He sat with the particular patience of a man who had learned that the first obligation of any real investigation was stillness, and waited while the resonance settled and catalogued what he had perceived. Old. The working was old. He could tell by its texture the way he could tell old parchment from new, by a quality that was more sensation than observation, and it was protective in a way that made his own best defensive charm work feel, by comparison, like a preliminary sketch. Whatever it was, it had not been assembled from a formula. It bore the signature of something that had taken root and been there a very long time, growing around itself into a structure of extraordinary persistence. He looked, without turning his head, along the length of the staff table. Severus Snape was watching the Potter boy, not discreetly. The gaze was fixed and unreadable, a practiced blankness that communicated, if it communicated anything, that communication was not the point. Flitwick had worked alongside him for 4 years and had never successfully read that expression. What he noted was the timing. Whatever had stressed that old protective working had done so at the precise moment Snape's eyes had found Harry Potter. He reached for his water glass and drank, slowly, and said nothing. Further along the table, Albus Dumbledore was deep in conversation with the new defense professor, the slight young man in the purple turban who had introduced himself to the staff at the start of term, with a ceremony that had struck Flitwick as slightly in excess of what the occasion required. Dumbledore was gesturing with the patient, elaborate precision he reserved for conversations about inconsequential things. Half-moon spectacles slightly crooked on his nose, silver beard catching the candlelight. The most tranquil man in the room, to all appearances, without apparent effort. Flitwick had known Albus Dumbledore long enough to understand that apparent tranquility was not the same thing as tranquility. He looked back at Harry Potter, who had stopped touching his forehead and was now examining the food in front of him with cautious interest, the expression of someone unaccustomed to having quite so many choices at once. The scar was still. The resonance had faded. Whatever had reached across the great hall and pulled at that old working had released it, for now, and the boy was simply a first year at his first feast, reaching for a second roll, unaware that anything had happened at all. Flitwick ate the remainder of his dinner with a concentration that had nothing to do with the food. His office in Ravenclaw Tower was at the end of a corridor, tucked into a space so narrow that most full-grown witches and wizards found it subtly unwelcoming, which suited him perfectly. The shelves ran floor to ceiling and were stuffed with books, annotated in 3 different inks, with objects in various stages of enchantment, with the accumulated peculiarities of a long professional life. It smelled of old parchment and the faint metallic sweetness of decades of practiced casting, absorbed into the walls like a second coat of paint. He sat at his desk without lighting additional lamps. The pale glow from the window was sufficient for what he needed to do, which was mostly think. Lily Evans Potter. He had not thought of her specifically in years, not by name, not as a distinct person rather than a grief held at the appropriate professional distance. She had been dead for a decade, which still struck him, at odd moments, as something that had not quite finished becoming real. Lily Evans had understood charm work the way very few students in a long career ever do, not as a formula to be recited, but as a living structure, something that persisted and evolved and responded to the intention behind it. She had been, without qualification, the most naturally gifted charm student he had ever taught, and he had not changed his mind about that in 10 years. An ancient, powerful, and long-lasting counter-charm. That was the phrase that had circulated in the careful, cautious weeks after Godric's Hollow. Never formally confirmed, always hedged with appropriate qualifications, but present in the conversation nonetheless. A sacrificial protection. He had found the concept theoretically elegant at the time, filed it away with the appropriate professional interest, and had not thought about it with any urgency since. He looked at the surface of his desk and considered the texture of what he had felt, the age of it, the quality of the caster's signature embedded in it, the particular intelligence of a working designed not just to protect, but to persist beyond the person who had made it. And then he considered the pulse, the stress, the sensation of something old being tested, briefly, by a source of pressure he could not yet identify or locate. He was not certain. He was a scholar, and scholars did not permit themselves conclusions before the evidence warranted them. He had felt something. He had noted the timing. He required more before he could form a view about what any of it meant. He reached for his notebook, uncapped his pen, and wrote down exactly what he knew. 3 weeks into term, Phileas Flitwick announced to his first-year Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs that they would be attempting Wingardium Leviosa. The classroom arranged itself accordingly. Chairs scraped back. Parchment was hastily put away. Several students reached for their wands before he had finished the sentence, with considerably more eagerness than their technique had yet warranted, and Flitwick watched them from his position at the front of the room, elevated, as always, by the specific arrangement of books on his chair that had ceased to register as unusual to anyone who knew him, and felt the mild, particular satisfaction of a teacher at the point in a new year when a class had settled enough to actually want something. He had set out the feathers himself that morning, one per desk, placed at careful intervals, light and responsive and immediately forgiving, the sort of object that would give a correct Wingardium Leviosa an immediately visible result, because visibility was essential at this stage. Students who felt nothing happen would eventually decide nothing was going to happen, and he had found over 3 decades that the period between a student's first failure and their first honest giving up was very short. The feather was designed to close that gap. "The wand movement," he said, lifting his voice over the ambient rustle of 28 expectant students, "is in 2 parts. Swish, then flick, not a single continuous motion. 2 distinct actions with a clear boundary between them. The feather rises on the flick. The swish only sets your line." He demonstrated at the front of the room, slowly and distinctly, and the air above his desk shimmered in a faint, responsive way. The incantation. Wingardium Leviosa. Stress the O. Long second syllable on the second word. Rushing the middle collapses the structure of the charm. He looked around the room. "Quietly, please. There is no advantage to being first." The room dissolved into the murmuring, slightly chaotic activity of 28 11-year-olds attempting charm work with varying degrees of preparation and nearly identical degrees of conviction. Flitwick listened from the front with the practiced half-attention of long experience. Most first attempts produced nothing, which was correct, which was how it went, and then stepped down from his arrangement of books and began to move through the desks. Wand grip was the problem he encountered most at this stage, and he addressed it wherever he found it, which was at nearly every other desk. Fingers too tight around the handle, wrist too rigid. The impulse to grip harder when something didn't work was understandable and almost universally counterproductive. He said so, individually, at each set of frustrated knuckles he encountered, because he had found over the years that students heard this instruction as a general observation until it was said to them specifically, at which point it became advice. He paused at a girl in the second row to correct the angle of her elbow. He paused at the boy 2 desks over, who had somehow made his feather adhere to the tip of his wand rather than lift from the desk, which was technically interesting and practically unhelpful, and he filed the error away for future attention. He noted in passing that Neville Longbottom's feather was rotating slowly in place on the desk surface rather than rising, which was not the intended effect, but was not nothing, and suggested an unusual wand angle worth investigating on the second pass. He reached Harry Potter's desk last, having deliberately organized his route through the room to arrive there at the end rather than the beginning, which was not something he could have explained to anyone without sounding unhinged. "Wand arm a little lower, Mr. Potter. Yes, exactly like that. Now try the swish. He did not pay significant attention to what the boy's feather did when Harry tried the motion, or not primarily. What he paid attention to, what he became suddenly entirely aware of at desk-side proximity, so close that he could see the grain of the wood under the boy's fingers and the faint shadow of the scar at the edge of his fringe, was something that had nothing to do with the lesson. At this range, it did not require interpretation. It resolved into specifics the way a blurred shape resolved into a face when you moved close enough. 2 layers. Not adjacent, but distinct. Not overlapping, but discrete structures existing simultaneously in the same space. Good. Now the flick. Sharp, right at the end of the motion. The outer layer was blood magic of the old, deliberate kind. Not wand work in any conventional sense. This had been built rather than cast over time, under conditions that could not be manufactured. It cohered around the boy with the solidity of something that had been there long enough to become structural, not incidental. Protective in intention and in construction, beyond any doubt. And deteriorating, not in the long, gradual way that old enchantments weakened across generations. This had the quality of fraying, the quality of something under active and ongoing pressure. Something, somewhere, was pushing against it from outside, and had been for some time. Leviosa, Harry said quietly. The feather shifted forward on the desk, an inch at most, and stopped. Nearly there. Don't let the pause between swish and flick become a gap. It should be a boundary, not a stop. He moved on, corrected a wrist grip 1 desk down, noted the girl at the far end of the row had achieved a 1/4 inch of lift and was concentrating with the focused quiet of someone who understood that talking about it would make it stop. He did not interrupt her. The inner layer was what he could not account for. He turned it over in his professional attention as he made his way back toward the front of the room, with the particular combination of scholarly fascination and unease that arose when he encountered something with no entry in his catalogue. It was not a charm, not a curse, active or dormant. Not any dark arts construction he had encountered in 4 decades of deliberate study, and he had studied them deliberately, because a charms practitioner who could not identify hostile enchantment at proximity was, in his considered view, only half equipped for his role. What it was bore no resemblance to any intentional casting. It sat at the scar itself, not layered over it, but resident within it, and it behaved like a mark left behind, rather than a thing placed there from outside. Dense and residual and ancient in a way that preceded the boy's life entirely. He could not classify it. He had never encountered its type before, which was not a sentence he said often about anything. He filed it. He moved on. Behind him, a clear and slightly impatient voice said, "You're not doing the swish right. It's like this. Look." He turned to see the bushy-haired girl at the middle table, Granger, demonstrating the wand movement for the red-haired boy beside her, Weasley, who was watching with the expression of someone balancing irritation against the evidence currently rising from her desk. Her feather was 2 inches off the wood and holding there, perfectly steady, while she kept her wand extended with the careful deliberateness of someone repeating a motion that had just worked for the first time and did not intend to let it stop. Flitwick felt a small, clean flare of professional pleasure and decided not to interrupt. Harry Potter, 2 desks away, had turned to watch as well. He had his hands in his lap and his feather flat on the desk, and he was looking at Granger's hovering feather with an expression that Flitwick had seen before on students who were still deciding whether they believed the magic was real. Not doubtful, exactly, but not yet convinced in the way that seeing it happen in front of you made you convinced, as though watching it work for someone else was the last piece of evidence he had been waiting for. He had no idea that anything had happened around him at all. Flitwick returned to his desk, climbed back to his books, and opened the notebook he had kept below the register. Outer layer, he wrote, in the shorthand he used for anything he did not want students reading over his shoulder. Blood magic, protective, old construction, built, not cast, deteriorating under active stress, not natural decay, source of pressure unidentified, inner layer, at scar, unknown, no match in charm, curse, or DA taxonomy. Residual, arrived with the mark rather than placed upon it. Cannot classify. He underlined the last 3 words once, then again. He looked up at the classroom, where 28 students were making their various and imperfect progresses toward a floating feather, and at Harry Potter in the middle of them, pushing his fringe back from his forehead, adjusting his grip, and trying once more. He would need to speak to the headmaster. He had not requested the meeting easily. 3 days had passed between the charms lesson and the moment he had finally knocked on the headmaster's door. 3 days of careful review, of cross-referencing what he knew against what he could properly claim to know, of sitting with his uncertainty long enough to distinguish it from the reluctance of a man who would rather not have found what he had found. He was a scholar who brought incomplete evidence to an important table did no one any service. By the time he climbed the spiral staircase, his findings were arranged and his language considered, and he was sure. Dumbledore received him with the unhurried courtesy that was as natural to him as breathing. Half-moon spectacles, long silver beard, the easy stillness of a man who was very rarely made to hurry, who stood to greet his visitor and gestured to the chair across the desk as though this were an ordinary evening conversation between colleagues. "Phileas," he said, "please sit." The charms master sat. He had not been in this office many times without a reason, and he was not here without one now. He placed his hands on the arms of the chair and looked at the headmaster directly. "Albus, I need to speak to you about Harry Potter's scar." The sentence landed in the room without producing any visible effect. Dumbledore had a truly extraordinary capacity for receiving information without showing what he thought of it. The blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles remained attentive and mild. "Tell me what you've observed," he said. The charms master told him. He worked through it methodically and without excess. The pulse at the start of term feast, the full identification at desk-side proximity during the first charms lesson, the 2 distinct layers, the nature and quality of each. He described the outer layer's construction with the precision that, he hoped, communicated clearly that he was not speculating. He was a former dueling champion. He had practiced combat charm work in arenas where a mistaken assessment of the magical working around you was the last assessment you made. He knew the difference between an old protective enchantment in natural, graceful decline and one whose deterioration was being driven by something other than time. "The outer layer is structured as a bond of blood," he said. "The construction is exceptional. Among the most thoroughly designed blood magic I have encountered in a professional career I do not need to tell you the length of. And it is deteriorating. Not at the rate I would expect from a working of its age and quality. Something is accelerating the process." He paused. He had decided he would say the next part simply. "The caster's signature is present in the construction. Blood magic always carries it. I could not have identified it by feel alone, but the combination of what I observed and what I know about the conditions required to activate a blood bond of this type, and the fact that you are the one who placed the boy with his mother's sister, amounts to an implication I would be professionally dishonest to ignore. A pause. You designed it, the charms master said. Dumbledore was quiet. When he spoke, it was with the care of a man who had considered several formulations and arrived at the simplest. I did, he said. Yes. The charms master had prepared for denial or deflection, or any of the several responses that very powerful people made when confronted with knowledge they had not expected to account for. He had not fully prepared for the direct acknowledgement, offered without ceremony, which required a moment's adjustment. The bond of blood, Dumbledore continued, is the most durable form of protective enchantment I know how to design. Lily's sacrifice was its foundation, a love so complete that it could not be manufactured and cannot be replicated. The charm was meant to hold until Harry was old enough to protect himself. It has done that. He has grown to 11 in a house where no one who wished him harm could touch him. His voice was very gentle, very controlled. The design worked. The design is deteriorating, the charms master said. Within parameters I would characterize as acceptable, Dumbledore said. Some degradation is natural at this age. Albus, he kept his voice level. He had practiced this. What I observed in that classroom was not gradual, age-appropriate decay. I want to be precise about this, because the distinction is the reason I am sitting here rather than having filed a note and moved on. I am applying the full weight of 4 decades of professional experience to this statement. The degradation I observed is consistent with active pressure being applied to the outer charm from an external source. Something is pulling at it. The deterioration pattern does not match any model for the natural aging of blood magic. It matches a model in which a charm is under continuous external stress. He stopped. He watched Dumbledore's face. There was something there. Very small, a recognition, or rather the suppression of one, a moment when the professional composure fractionally reorganized itself, so briefly that anyone less attentive would have missed it. The charms master did not miss it. I appreciate the precision of your concern, Dumbledore said. I want you to know I am taking this seriously, Phileas. There are aspects of Harry's situation that I am not in a position to discuss. Not because I am dismissing what you have found, and not because I lack respect for what your expertise permits you to perceive. I am asking for time. I am asking for trust. There are reasons I have managed this as I have, and I give you my word, they are genuine. The charms master looked at him steadily. What is applying the pressure? He said. What is the external source? I cannot tell you that at present, Dumbledore said, which was not the same as I do not know. They both understood that. He left. He descended the spiral staircase and walked back through the castle corridors with the particular quiet of a man who has just been given patience and trust in response to a technical question and knows exactly what has happened. He was loyal. That was not performance. It was simply the truth of him, shaped across a long career in a school he had given his working life to. Loyalty was not the same as satisfaction. He had walked in with precise findings and a clear professional concern, and had walked out, having been managed, gracefully, and without a single demonstrably false statement, by a man who was considerably better at managing people than the charms master was at resisting it. He was not satisfied. He was not yet certain what he was going to do about that. In the headmaster's office, after the footsteps on the staircase had faded, Dumbledore sat alone. Active stress. Yes, the charms master had read it correctly, which Dumbledore had known before the meeting started, and had hoped, with a faint and not entirely rational optimism, that he had not. The outer charm, his design, His work, the most durable protection he had known how to build in 1981, was under active pressure from a source currently resident in this school, and the gap between what he had told Phileas and what he knew was vast, and the gap between what he knew and what he could afford to have anyone else know was vaster still. He had thought about this in October, looking at the third floor from the corridor outside. He had thought about it at the Quidditch match, watching the broom from the stands, and feeling, at a distance, the charm's destabilization. He had been calculating since September, and his calculations had lately become less reassuring. He thought of Lily Potter, 21 years old and deliberately unmoved, and the thing she had made that night was something he had designed a theoretical framework for, and still could not fully account for in practice. Her work had held. Whatever it was at the core of the boy's scar, he had suspicions, but suspicions were not yet knowledge, was still there, and the outer construction he had placed around it was fraying, and he needed time. He took off his half-moon spectacles and set them on the desk, and sat with the discomfort of a man who had made a defensible choice a decade ago and was beginning to understand what it would cost to defend it. The Quidditch pitch in late October carried the kind of cold that had nothing to do with wind, a low, damp cold that had been absorbed into the wooden stands and sat there, patient and indifferent, finding its way through robes and wool alike. The charms master had attended every Quidditch match since joining the Hogwarts staff, which was more matches than he found it useful to count, and he had always attended in the same spirit, appreciation for a thing competently done, without personal investment in which side did it. He was in the staff section, with a reasonable view of the pitch, and had been watching the match for perhaps 8 minutes, when the quality of the air to his left changed. Not the air itself, the charm work within it. Specifically, the faint, ambient signature that had been present at the outer edge of his perception throughout the last several weeks. The bond of blood, fraying, deteriorating, exerting its quiet distress from the general direction of Harry Potter. At the far end of the pitch, Harry was on his broom, working the position the Gryffindors had given him in September, and the broom had just done something that was not a controlled maneuver. It had jerked, sideways, sharply and without warning, a motion that had nothing to do with the rider's intent or any gust of wind the charms master could detect from his position in the stands. He went still. The outer charm, the bond of blood, his familiar subject, the working he had been observing with methodical professional attention since the start of term, had just produced the magical equivalent of a struck chord, one sharp, resonant spike. Not the gradual, slow-grinding deterioration he had been tracking, but something sudden and structural, as though a very large, dark mass had moved into close alignment with the charm, and the charm had reacted to it. The signature was unmistakable. He had felt it once before, at the start of term feast, when Snape had looked at Harry across the great hall. This was larger. This was considerably larger. Harry was dangling from the broom with both hands, the broom still jerking beneath him, and the crowd around the charms master had come fully alive with the particular pitch that a stadium crowd made when something was wrong rather than merely dramatic. Shouting. A few screams, the general upwelling of human alarm at an 11-year-old hanging from a broomstick 300 feet above the ground. He did not look at Harry. He looked for the source. He moved his attention through the stands with the systematic precision of long professional practice. The resonance he had felt was not atmospheric, not a shift in ambient magic, not the general harmonic disturbance that large gatherings of magical people sometimes produced. It was directed. It had an orientation. He traced it the way he would trace a current in a river, by feeling which way the water pushed, and the direction it came from was to his left and slightly forward in the seating. He found Severus Snape 4 rows down. Snape was seated at the edge of his row, with his robes gathered close, and his eyes fixed on Harry Potter, and his lips were moving. The charms master could not hear the words at this distance. He could feel the working, could feel it the way you felt a subsonic vibration, not through the air, but through the material of the air between you. Something directed, focused, narrowly aimed at the broom or at the space, immediately surrounding it, with the precision that only accomplished, long-practiced charm work produced. He held himself very still and thought about what he was looking at. The bond of blood had destabilized at the moment the broom started jerking, and Snape was casting something directed at Harry, and those two facts existed in the same moment. But which fact was the cause of which? Whether the destabilization had happened because of Snape's working, or whether Snape's working was a response to a destabilization from a different source, that question required information he could not assemble from 4 rows and 30 feet of ambient crowd noise. He watched Snape's face. He monitored the quality of the working in the air. He could not resolve it. The broom gave one final violent twist and then steadied. Harry pulled himself upright with an economy of motion that in a child of 11 suggested very fast reflexes and what appeared to be an almost physical stubbornness about falling. The crowd's alarm converted immediately into enthusiasm. 30 seconds after that, Harry was diving and pulling up, clutching something gold in his right fist, and the Gryffindor end of the pitch erupted. The charms master stayed in his seat while the crowd came apart around him and streamed toward the exits and toward the pitch itself. He stayed until the noise had moved far enough away that the stands were mostly quiet, and he sat with his hands on his knees and reviewed what he had just observed. The destabilization had been the most severe he had recorded since he first detected the charm at the feast. Not a deepening of gradual deterioration. This had been a spike, sharp and sudden, a structural disruption rather than a progression. The kind of disruption produced by proximity to something with an enormous dark presence, something that the bond of blood had registered and reacted to, the way a compass needle registered a magnet. He had found Snape in the stands, casting something directed at the broom at approximately the same moment. He could not confirm whether Snape's working had caused the destabilization or countered whatever else was producing it. That was the ambiguity he would not paper over with an interpretation he could not support. He filed Snape as a variable and noted the ambiguity. He wrote his record that evening. Quidditch match, bond of blood. Sharp destabilization, most severe recorded. Onset sudden, not consistent with gradual decay. Duration, approximately 90 seconds, coinciding with broom incident. Source of dark gravity resonance, within stadium or immediate vicinity. SS observed, casting directed working at Harry at approximately same onset. Effect of SS casting ambiguous, cannot determine whether causal or responsive. Keeping open. He set down the pen and looked at what he had written. What was not ambiguous was the most important conclusion. Every observation he had made since September pointed in the same direction. The start of term feast, the classroom. Now this. The bond of blood did not destabilize from a distance. It destabilized under proximity, specific proximity, something with a very particular dark signature that was not Snape and was not the usual ambient background of a school where dark arts were studied. Whatever it was had been here since the feast. It had been here when the term started. He added one more line at the bottom of the page, in letters slightly larger than his customary shorthand. The stressor is inside Hogwarts. He did not underline it. He had been careful in this notebook not to perform certainty he did not have. He had it now. He was certain. Harry Potter, crossing the entrance hall below the charms master's window an hour later, with a broomstick under his arm and a bruise along his jaw and the particular brightness of someone still inside a good afternoon, did not look like a boy who was aware that anything had happened to him. His scar was half hidden by his fringe. He was saying something to the tall, red-haired boy beside him, and laughing at the response. And he did not break stride, did not reach for his forehead, did not do any of the things a person did when they understood that the afternoon had been something other than a Quidditch match. He had felt it, though. He knew he'd felt it. The burning behind his forehead that had started when the broom began to buck, sharp and wrong, in a way he didn't have a word for yet. He had been thinking about it, on and off, while Ron replayed the match in enthusiastic detail around him, and the conclusion he kept arriving at was, he didn't know. The scar had hurt. It had stopped hurting. His broom had nearly thrown him, and then it hadn't. Adults knew things he didn't. He was already aware of this as a general condition of his existence at Hogwarts, a fact about the landscape rather than a specific suspicion about anything in particular. He put the broom away. He went up to the common room. His scar had stopped hurting. He set the afternoon in the part of his mind where he kept things he did not have the information to understand yet. And he left it there. The letter took 4 days to write. Not because the content required 4 days. He had it arranged inside an evening, structured with the precision that 4 decades of academic and professional documentation had given him, every claim supported and every claim's support cited. The 4 days were for something else. They were for sitting with what he was about to do, and understanding it clearly enough that when he did it, he would not be able to tell himself he had acted without knowing what he was choosing. He had been inside Hogwarts for a very long time. He had watched 6 headmasters come and go, and had served under the current one since before the war that had ended 10 years ago, and he had found, over those years, the particular equilibrium that long service in an institution provided. A trust not just in the individual who ran it, but in the institution itself, in the accumulated weight of what this school was and what it required. Dumbledore had earned that trust twice over. The Charms Master was not someone who gave his professional confidence easily, and he had given it, and it had been warranted. This made what he was doing harder, and it did not make it wrong. He had one question that he returned to at the end of each of the 4 evenings to make sure his answer remained stable. The question was, had he been given a sufficient response to a specific professional concern about a child's safety? He had been given patience and trust and a confirmation that Dumbledore knew something he was not sharing. That was the response. He reviewed it each evening against the concern that had produced it, a deteriorating protective charm under active stress from a source located inside the school. The stressor confirmed at the Quidditch match, the destabilization sharper than anything produced by simple decay. And he arrived at the same answer each time. He had not been given a sufficient response. On the 4th evening, he uncapped his pen. The inquiry was addressed to the ICW's Oversight and Investigation Office, not to the Supreme Mugwump. That distinction was the first and most important structural choice. The Supreme Mugwump in 1991 was Albus Dumbledore, who was also the headmaster of Hogwarts, the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, and, as the Charms Master, had by this point established to his professional satisfaction, the architect of the enchantment currently under investigation. An inquiry addressed to the Supreme Mugwump in those circumstances was not an inquiry. It was a report to the subject of the inquiry, which was not what he was doing. He set out the material facts in the order in which he had observed them, without rhetorical enhancement. Anomalous magical signature detected at the start of term feast. A sharp destabilization of what he had subsequently identified as a bond of blood protective enchantment. Confirmation of 2 distinct magical layers in the same location. The bond of blood, outer deteriorating, underactive stress, and an unclassified dark residue. Inner, at the scar itself, unknown construction, no analogue in his professional catalogue. Direct conversation with the headmaster, who had confirmed the existence of the bond of blood, attributed its design to himself, and declined to identify the source of the active stress. Quidditch match, destabilization event, sharp and sudden, consistent with proximity of a significant dark presence. Conclusion: the stressor is located inside the school. He cited his credentials without false modesty because the credibility of the observation depended on the credibility of the observer, and he was not going to undermine his own inquiry by leaving that unstated. Charms Master, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, former dueling champion, foremost practitioner of charms within the British wizarding establishment. 41 years of professional practice. He noted the subject's international significance. Harry Potter was not simply a child with an unusual scar. He was the survivor of Voldemort's failed killing curse in October 1981, the event that had ended the First Wizarding War, and from whose outcome every member nation of the ICW had benefited. The protective arrangement around him was not a domestic British matter. It was an arrangement made without oversight by the holder of the ICW's own highest office, and that arrangement was now in a demonstrated state of deterioration. He dried the ink. He folded the letter and sealed it, and did not permit himself to sit with it any longer than it took to attach it to the leg of the owl that carried his official correspondence. The owl was out of the window before his second thoughts could catch up with his first. He watched it go, then sat back in his chair and thought about Dumbledore. He did not know that Severus Snape had been watching from 3 doors down the corridor. Snape had been watching the Charms Master watch Harry since the 2nd week of term, which was when the pattern had become visible to someone who was himself watching Harry from a different angle and for entirely different reasons. He had not been certain until the evening of the Quidditch match that what the Charms Master was doing constituted anything more than unusual attentiveness. He had been certain since. He had seen the Charms Master return from the stands with the contained, collected focus of a man who had just confirmed something he had suspected, and he had watched the lights in the small office at the end of the corridor stay lit until well past midnight for 4 consecutive evenings, and he had drawn the conclusions that a man with his particular intelligence and experience was equipped to draw. He could not intercept the letter. He had no authority that would justify it, and attempting it would have required explaining the attempt, which he was not prepared to do. He did what he could do. He went to Dumbledore. Dumbledore listened without visible reaction, which was what he did when the news was serious. He thanked Snape, which was rare. He did not say what he intended to do, and Snape did not ask, and Snape left the office with the familiar, uncomfortable awareness of how much of Dumbledore's thinking was conducted in the parts of his mind that didn't produce conversation. He moved quickly. The supreme mugwump of the ICW had significant procedural authority over matters of international concern, and he used it. A communication went out from the headmaster's office that evening, directed to the ICW's administrative body, framed as a clarification. The matter concerned a domestic British child protection arrangement currently under his personal supervision. Any inquiry from within British jurisdiction should properly be referred to his office. He had the authority. He invoked it with the fluency of a man who had used institutional language for a very long time and understood which phrases carried the most weight. He received his answer the following morning. The inquiry had been received and logged by the ICW's Oversight and Investigation Office at 17 minutes past 9 on the previous evening, 40 minutes before his own communication had arrived. Under ICW procedure, a logged inquiry involving the active holder of the supreme mugwump position constituted a mandatory conflict of interest that could not be resolved by that holder's own administrative action. The matter had already been referred to the ICW's independent review structure. His communication had been received and noted and had no procedural effect. He folded the response and set it on his desk. He did not panic. Panic was not a thing he permitted himself, because panic consumed the resources that were needed for what came after it, and what came after it was the only thing that mattered now. He needed to think clearly about what the ICW would find, and what he was going to say to them, and in what order. And he needed to think about what he was not going to say, and the list of things he could not say was considerably longer than the list of things he could. He thought about Phileas Flitwick, who had sat across his desk and asked a precise professional question and had not been given a sufficient answer. He thought about that with something closer to rueful respect than anger. Then he thought about what was under the third-floor trapdoor, and about what was sharing the school with an 11-year-old boy, and he began to calculate in earnest. The formal instrument arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by an ICW courier owl, whose plumage was the institutional grey of an organization that had been conducting formal correspondence for nearly 3 centuries. It was addressed to the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, in his capacity as a private individual, a distinction that had been made deliberately in the salutation, and that Dumbledore registered with the attention it deserved. He read it through once, standing at his desk. Then he sat down and read it again. The language was formal and precise, and left no interpretive latitude. As the named architect of the enchantment under investigation, and the current holder of the office of Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, he was required under ICW Oversight Procedure 14, Article 3, to recuse himself from all advisory, directive, and supervisory roles in the inquiry. This recusal would remain in effect until the inquiry was formally concluded. Decisions regarding access, scheduling, and scope would fall to the ICW's oversight panel rather than to the Supreme Mugwump's office. His cooperation was expected. His obstruction would be noted. He set the document down on his desk. He had been headmaster of Hogwarts for 26 years. He had held the position of Supreme Mugwump since the end of the war, during which time he had also served continuously as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. These 3 roles had never, in that period, been in direct conflict. There had been no occasion until now when they had positioned him as simultaneously the subject of an investigation, the highest official of the body conducting it, and the person controlling access to the location in which the investigation was to take place. As headmaster, he controlled Hogwarts. Every door, every corridor, every person admitted past the wards. All of it ran through him. No outside party could examine Harry Potter or the premises without his permission, and while he was required to provide that permission under the recusal instrument, he could shape the terms and timing with considerable precision. As Supreme Mugwump, he now had no standing in this matter. He had been made a private citizen of a sort, not stripped of his office, but sidelined within it, which was in some ways more awkward than removal. As Chief Warlock, he had British domestic authority. The ICW did not. Except that the ICW's jurisdiction covered international matters, and the Oversight Panel had already argued, in the inquiry's formal intake documents, that the status of Harry Potter was an international matter, that the end of the First Wizarding War had been an international event, and that a protective arrangement made around the survivor of that war's ending, without oversight, by the holder of the ICW's highest office, fell properly under international review. He could contest that jurisdictional claim. He had thought carefully about whether to do so. The answer he kept arriving at was that contesting the jurisdiction would cost him more, politically and practically, than accepting it, because the process of contesting it would itself become a story, and that story would be considerably less flattering than the inquiry itself. He sent for Snape. Snape arrived in the way he always arrived when summoned directly, promptly, and without looking as though he had hurried. He closed the office door behind him and stood without invitation to sit, and Dumbledore told him, briefly and precisely, what the instrument on the desk contained. Snape's face did not change. It very rarely changed, and when it did, the change was a controlled and considered revision rather than an involuntary response, a quality that Dumbledore had always found both professionally useful and personally somewhat unsettling. He watched and found what moved briefly in Snape's expression was not what he had expected. Not anger, not the apprehension of a man whose double life had just been placed closer to outside scrutiny. Something quieter, more internal. Snape said nothing for a moment. Then, "How far back will they go?" "As far as the evidence requires," Dumbledore said, which was the honest answer. "And the evidence begins where?" Snape said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "At Godric's Hollow," Dumbledore said. "That is where the protective sequence begins." Snape was quiet again. He said, in a voice that had been carefully emptied of everything except neutrality, "And what is your instruction?" "I have none," Dumbledore said, which was true in the sense that there was nothing Snape could usefully do. "I am telling you because you have a right to know the landscape." Snape left before the silence could develop into something that would require either of them to fill it. What the ICW investigation would find, if it went far enough back, was a prophecy. The prophecy led to a conversation overheard in a corridor outside an inn in Hogsmeade in the spring of 1980, which led to a young man carrying what he had overheard to a master who was not yet, at that moment, anyone Snape would have called a Dark Lord without considering that a compliment. It led, in a sequence Snape had been unable to stop and had spent 10 years unable to stop living inside, to the death of a woman with green eyes who had told him, once, with complete sincerity, that she forgave him. He did not know what the ICW would eventually find. He knew what the evidence trail, if followed with sufficient care, eventually reached. He walked back through the corridors of the school, and he said nothing about it to anyone. Harry did not know that any of this was happening. He knew some things were different. He could not have said precisely when it had started. Sometime after the Quidditch match, he thought, or maybe before. It was hard to be certain because different was difficult to locate when you had only one term's worth of normal for comparison. What he knew was that the charms master had started watching him in a way that was not the same as the way teachers usually watched students. It was quieter and more specific than attention. It was more like the way someone watched a door they were waiting for. He had mentioned it to Ron, who had said that was a weird thing to notice about a teacher, and then had gone quiet in a way that suggested he had also noticed it and had been trying to decide whether to mention it. "He's been doing it since the start of term," Hermione said, when Harry brought it up at dinner, lowering her voice in the way she did when she had been thinking about something for longer than she was going to admit to. She was 12 now. Her birthday had been in September. She had the particular quality of someone who noticed details and was not sure yet whether noticing them made you useful or simply anxious. "I first saw it at the feast, when you clutched your head," Harry said. "My scar." "Yes," she said. "He looked at you, and then he looked, I don't know how to describe it, like he was listening to something." "He probably looked at everyone," Ron said, unconvincingly. Harry thought about it after dinner, going up the stairs, in the space between the noise of the common room and the relative quiet of the dormitory. He thought about it with the slightly helpless feeling of someone who had noticed that several adults were arranging themselves around him in ways that all seemed to be about him, and were not being explained to him, and who had no framework for understanding what this meant, except that it was happening, and he was 11 and there was nothing useful he could do about it. He thought, something is going on. He filed it. He went to sleep. The charms master had watched Dumbledore's response to the formal instrument arrive from a distance he considered appropriate. The end of a corridor, visible only if you were specifically looking. He had not been looking for a reaction that would tell him he had done something wrong. He had been looking for something he could not name precisely, something in the nature of confirmation that the machinery he had set in motion was real and would continue moving, and that what he had done constituted an action rather than merely a gesture. Dumbledore had read the instrument standing up. He had sat down. He had sent for Snape. That was confirmation enough. The charms master walked back to his office by a longer route than necessary, through the corridors where the afternoon light came through the high windows and fell across the flagstones in the long, particular way it fell in November, and he thought about the school and what he owed it and what it had cost him over a very long career to have standards that he was not willing to compromise without cause. He had cause. He had set the thing in motion. It could not be taken back. He was not sure yet whether he should have wanted to take it back. He thought probably not. The note was delivered to Harry during Transfiguration, slipped onto the corner of his desk by a second year he didn't know. It said, in the clear, formal hand of someone who wrote notes professionally, Mr. Potter is requested to attend the headmaster's office at 2:30. He is excused from afternoon lessons for this purpose. He went. What else do you do with a note like that? He had been in Dumbledore's office once before, briefly, at the beginning of term, when everyone in his year had been through to confirm their schedules. He had not retained much of the room from that visit, only an impression of height and light and an assortment of objects that seemed to do things when you weren't directly looking at them. He remembered the portraits on the wall, the painted former headmasters who had watched him with an attention he'd found unsettling, and he remembered that the office had felt like a room with a great deal of history that he wasn't part of yet. He was let in by a 6th-year prefect who knocked and then left without explaining anything, and he went in. There were 3 people already there. Dumbledore behind his desk, which Harry had expected. The charms master seated to one side, very still, which Harry had not expected, but which made a kind of sense, given that the charms master had been watching him in that particular way for the last several weeks. And someone he didn't recognize at all, a person seated opposite Dumbledore's desk in a high-backed chair, wearing robes of a style and quality that suggested they had come from somewhere with different tailoring customs than Britain. They were watching him with a professional attentiveness that didn't feel unfriendly, exactly, but didn't feel warm either. It felt like the attentiveness of someone doing a job. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Please sit down." Harry sat. He arranged himself in the remaining chair, straight-backed, hands in his lap, the way he had learned to sit in a room where he didn't understand the rules yet, so that he at least didn't take up more space than was called for. "Thank you for coming," Dumbledore said, which was a strange thing to say to someone who had not been given a choice about coming. But Harry had found that adults said this sort of thing, and the appropriate response was to nod. He nodded. "This is a representative of the International Confederation of Wizards," Dumbledore said, indicating the person in the high-backed chair, with a gesture so easy it might have been an introduction at a dinner party. "The ICW is an organization that represents wizarding governments internationally. You may not have encountered it yet in your studies." He hadn't. He filed it for later. "The representative has requested an opportunity to look at a magical signature near your scar," Dumbledore continued. "The scar on your forehead. Not an examination today. That will be a separate appointment. Today is simply an introduction." He paused for a moment. "I wanted to be present for it." Harry looked at the representative. The representative looked at him with the same professional attentiveness, and said, in a voice that was careful and precise and carried a faint quality of formal script, "Thank you for agreeing to this, Mr. Potter. I understand it is unusual. I am here to conduct an official inquiry into certain magical properties of the site of your scar. My role is investigative, and I will not be taking any action without your understanding of what is proposed." It was the kind of sentence that had been constructed to be reassuring and was slightly too formal to fully succeed at it. "What kind of magical properties?" Harry said. There was the briefest pause, the kind of pause that happened when a question had been anticipated, but the questioner had asked it slightly sooner than expected. "A site of unusual magical activity," the representative said, "related to the events of your early childhood." He watched Dumbledore while the representative said this. He wasn't sure why he watched Dumbledore rather than the representative. It was the kind of instinct that came from years of paying close attention to adults in rooms where decisions were being made about him. Dumbledore's expression didn't change. It remained what it usually was, kind, attentive, slightly distant in the way of someone thinking several things simultaneously. But something about the quality of his stillness was arranged. Harry could not have explained what he meant by arranged. He only knew that he had learned to notice the difference between a person sitting naturally and a person sitting carefully. "Your scar," Dumbledore said gently, "is remarkable. You have lived with it all your life, and it is simply part of your face, as it should be, and I don't want this to be more alarming than it needs to be. There is a trace of very old magic in it that the representative has proper professional interest in examining. The examination itself will be entirely non-invasive and will cause you no harm. All right?" Harry said. "All right." He said it in the tone of someone who had weighed whether asking for more information would produce more information, and had concluded, not for the first time in his life, that it probably wouldn't. He sat through the rest of the meeting with the patience that had been, for as long as he could remember, one of his more reliable qualities. He answered the questions the representative asked: his date of birth, how long he had been at Hogwarts, whether he experienced any unusual sensation in or near the scar, and if so, under what circumstances. He answered honestly. He said yes. Sometimes his scar hurt, briefly. He said he didn't know what caused it. He said he had assumed it was just something about him that he hadn't found the right question for yet. The representative wrote this down in a small book with a thin-nibbed pen, writing quickly and without apparent reaction. His scar didn't hurt during the meeting. It stayed entirely quiet, which he was mildly grateful for. In the corner of the room, the charms master was watching Dumbledore. Not the representative. Not Harry. Dumbledore, his hands resting on the desk, his expression of careful kindness, the moment when the representative had described the scar as a site of unusual magical activity, and Dumbledore had not corrected the phrase or supplemented it. He watched and noted everything that Dumbledore allowed to be said, and everything that Dumbledore didn't allow, which was considerable, and he thought about what "I wanted to be present for it" meant from the mouth of a man who had no formal role in this inquiry any longer, and had nonetheless positioned himself at the center of it, controlling what an 11-year-old boy was being told about his own body. He said nothing. His presence in this room was as the inquiry's originator, and he had no procedural standing to correct Dumbledore's framing. He sat, and he watched, and he thought that some versions of involvement looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from control. Harry told Ron about it that evening, sitting on the window seat in the Gryffindor common room, while rain blurred the view of the grounds outside. He told it accurately and in order. The note during Transfiguration, the 3 people in the office, the representative with the thin-nibbed pen, the phrase, "site of unusual magical activity." Ron's face went through several expressions. "The ICW," he said. That's the international one. My dad's mentioned it. They handle stuff between countries." He seemed to be fitting this information to Harry's scar and finding the combination confusing. Why would they care about your scar? Harry said he didn't know. "Did it hurt?" Ron asked. "In the meeting?" "No." Ron considered. "That's probably good," he said, which was not precisely illuminating, but was offered with the genuine helpfulness of someone who wanted to have something useful to say and had found the closest available thing. Harry watched the rain on the glass and thought about the headmaster's hands on his desk and about the charms master's very still quality in the corner of the room and about the word arranged, which he had no evidence for but which had not left him. He didn't know, and he was becoming increasingly aware that not knowing was the condition he was in, rather than a temporary state on the way to knowing. That evening in the headmaster's office, the representative set out a detailed schedule for the formal examination, a list of instruments required, a proposed duration, a set of protocols for documentation. Dumbledore read it through carefully and agreed to each item on the list with the equanimity of a man who had read many documents and found this one unremarkable. He agreed to a date, to a location within the castle, to the presence of relevant parties. He agreed to everything the procedure required, with the meticulous cooperation of someone who understood that the only remaining leverage available to him was goodwill. The instruments had been arranged on a table brought in for the occasion. Harry spent the first few minutes looking at them, the way he looked at most things in the wizarding world when he had no context, with careful attention, trying to read what they did from the way they were designed. They did not give much away. Several were glass, with faint internal structures that moved when the light shifted. One was brass, and resembled a compass, but pointed at nothing. One was a folded sheet of something that breathed, expanded and contracted with a steadiness that seemed wrong for paper. He sat in the chair they indicated, at the center of the room. Dumbledore was in the chair nearest the window, far enough from the instruments to be technically outside the working area. The charms master was against the wall to Harry's left. Neither spoke. "I'm going to use several diagnostic instruments, one at a time," the observer said. "I would ask you to sit still, breathe normally, and tell me if you feel anything uncomfortable. The instruments are passive. They measure. They do not alter or affect anything they examine." "Does it usually hurt?" Harry asked. "This kind of work?" "No," the observer said. "You may feel the working as a slight pressure. Some people are sensitive to diagnostic charm work. If you feel anything beyond mild pressure, please say so." Harry said he would, and sat back in the chair and set his hands on his knees, and was still. He had practiced being still for a long time before he came to Hogwarts, and it was a quality he retained even when his internal state was not still at all. The first instrument was brought close to his forehead. He felt nothing. The second was held a foot from his face for approximately 3 minutes, during which the observer wrote continuously, and Harry fixed his gaze on a point on the far wall and breathed normally. The third was the folded breathing parchment, set on the table and activated to produce a faint, almost subsonic sound that was absorbed into the quiet of the room. At some point during the third instrument, his scar twinged. Not painful. Brief. He had been asked to mention anything, so he did. "There," he said. "Not pain exactly." "Thank you," the observer said, and made a note. The formal presentation came after the observer reviewed their notes. Dumbledore had not moved from the window. The Charms Master had not moved from the wall. Their collective stillness had the quality of two people waiting for something they had both been expecting. "There are 3 significant findings," the observer said, addressing the room rather than any specific person. "I will describe each in turn. The first. A brief interval, the kind that preceded something formal. There is a protective enchantment present around the location of the scar. It is blood-based in construction, a bond of blood type working, of expert design and considerable age. The original casting appears to have been made approximately 10 years ago, at or around the time of the incident that created the scar. The observer looked at their notes. This enchantment is deteriorating. The rate of deterioration is significantly in excess of what I would expect from a working of this type, this age, and this construction quality. The deterioration pattern is consistent with active external pressure being applied to the enchantment structure. It is not aging naturally. Something is accelerating the degradation. Harry heard this description and understood approximately a third of it. He had not been a wizard long enough to know the exact dimensions of what blood-based bond of blood meant, but he understood deteriorating and accelerating the degradation, and those words sat in his chest in a way he didn't entirely like. "The second finding," the observer said. "There is a secondary magical signature at the scar site. It is located deeper than the bond of blood construction, closer to the scar itself, at or adjacent to it. This signature does not correspond to any known charm, curse, or dark arts construction in the ICW's formal registry." A pause. "This is the finding I consider most urgent. I have conducted formal examinations in a professional capacity for 19 years. I have not encountered a signature of this type before. It is dense, old, and residual in character. It does not behave like something that was placed there deliberately. It behaves like something that arrived." The room was quiet. Harry looked at his hands. He thought, "That is in my head. Whatever they are describing is in my head, and has been there since I was a baby, and nobody has told me any of this before now." He thought this very clearly and precisely, and then set it aside, because the middle of a formal examination was not the place to process it. "The third finding is in some ways the most interpretable," the observer said. "There is a trace residue at the scar site, consistent with the rebound of a killing curse. The pattern is a negative imprint, as though the curse struck and reversed, leaving a mark of the impact rather than of the curse itself. This is consistent with the documented account of what occurred in October 1981. The room stayed quiet for a moment that was longer than the previous quiet. "Thank you," Dumbledore said, in a voice that was very mild and very controlled. "That is clear." In the corridor outside Dumbledore's office, Severus Snape stood without a purpose he could have explained to anyone. He was there because the diagnostic charm work inside the room was producing a pressure he could feel at this range. Passive sensitivity, not legilimency, the low-level awareness that advanced dark arts practice developed over time. And he needed to know what they were finding. He could not hear what was being said. He could feel the 3 instruments at work in sequence. The second had run longest. Forensic magical investigation moved backward from evidence. The evidence was in Harry Potter's scar. The scar went back to October 1981, Godric's Hollow. Godric's Hollow went back to a prophecy, The prophecy went back to a corridor outside an inn in the spring of 1980, and a young man who had been standing there, and who had listened, and who had carried what he heard to someone. He was not afraid of exposure as a double agent. What he was afraid of was more specific: the possibility that a sufficiently thorough ICW investigation would eventually arrive at the question of who had given the prophecy to Voldemort, and that the answer was a matter of record in enough places that determined investigators, given time, would find it. He knew nothing about the dark signature in Harry's scar. His dread had nothing to do with dark signatures. It had to do with a dead woman with green eyes, and with the fact that he had set in motion, deliberately and in pursuit of his own interests, the sequence of events that killed her. He walked away before the meeting ended. Dumbledore sat alone in his office for a long time after everyone had gone. The Observer's 3 findings were formally documented now. They could not be undone or recalled. They existed as an official ICW record, a deteriorating bond of blood under active stress, a negative imprint of a killing curse's rebound, and a secondary dark signature of unknown origin and unknown classification. It was the third that he sat with. He had not wanted to know what it was. He had suspected, in the quiet of late evenings over several years, working backward from what he knew of the events of October 1981, and forward from certain theoretical principles about the nature of souls, and what a sufficiently depraved act of magic might do to one, he had suspected, and had not confirmed, and had arranged things so that confirmation remained a future problem. He had told himself that this was prudence, that acting on a suspicion was premature, that the child was safe, that the charm held, that there was time. The charm was deteriorating. The dark signature had been formally described by an experienced ICW examiner as something that had not been placed deliberately, but had arrived. The examiner had not said what that meant. The examiner did not know what that meant. Dumbledore looked at the table where the instruments had been arranged, and thought about what he suspected, and thought about the boy who had been sitting in that chair, looking at his hands in the particular way of someone processing something very large with carefully sustained composure. He had been managing this for 10 years. He had further to manage it now, and the terms had changed, and the room he had to work in had become considerably smaller. He took off his spectacles and sat with the discomfort of a man who had known something for a long time and was now sitting in a room where what he knew was documented. The panel could not compel Dumbledore to travel, and so the inquiry came to him, held in his school, on his ground, in a room adjacent to his office, with portraits of his predecessors on the walls. The panel had noted this without comment, having weighed the optics of demanding the headmaster travel against the optics of reasonable cooperation, and concluded the concession was worth making. Even under formal scrutiny, Dumbledore controlled the space. The panel appeared to understand this, and had decided not to treat it as the point. He sat before them at a table set up at the center of the room, not behind his desk. His own arrangement. He had declined the authority of his desk and offered the table of a man willing to be heard. It was a considered choice, as all his choices were, and it communicated something that was genuinely true. He was willing to be accountable. The question was whether willingness, at this stage, was sufficient. The panel's first question, laid out in the formal language of ICW investigative procedure, read from a document by a voice trained to communicate gravity without editorializing, addressed the placement of the child. Dumbledore listened to it with attention. He did not shift in his chair. He did not look at his hands. When the question was done, he answered it with the directness of a man who had prepared his account, and whose account was largely the truth. He had placed Harry Potter with Petunia Dursley, née Evans, who was Lily Potter's elder sister and the closest living blood relative on the maternal side. He had done this because the bond of blood required a blood relative's willing acceptance to function. He had done this in a private Muggle residential address because obscurity was the most effective protection available against magical enemies. He had done this without notifying the ICW or the British Ministry, because notification was itself a vulnerability. Because Voldemort's allies were not all dead in October 1981, and because a notification required the existence of a document, and a document could be found. The safety of an 11-month-old child with no ability to protect himself had required secrecy, and he had provided it. "The bond of blood," he said, when the panel moved to the second line of inquiry, "was the most durable protective enchantment I know how to design. It required Lily Potter's sacrifice at its foundation, a voluntary death in the service of love, freely chosen, not coerced, and Petunia Dursley's willing decision to accept her nephew into her home. Both conditions were met. The charm I built around that foundation was designed to last until Harry was old enough to protect himself. For 10 years it did exactly that. He grew up in a house where no one who wished him harm could reach him. The design worked. I do not apologize for designing something that worked." He said this last sentence with a quality of conviction that made it clear he was not performing conviction. He meant it. He had designed something extraordinary, and it had done what he intended it to do. The panel acknowledged the substance of this and noted it formally. Then they asked about the 3 simultaneous officers. "Your positions as Supreme Mugwump of this confederation, Chief Warlock of the British Wizengamot, and Headmaster of Hogwarts," the lead panelist said, "all held concurrently since before the events under review. None is restricted from concurrent holding under the relevant instruments. The question is not one of legality, it is one of structure. As Headmaster, you have sole authority over access to Harry Potter. As Supreme Mugwump, you exercised authority over international wizarding oversight. As Chief Warlock, you exercise authority over British domestic judicial proceedings. You are the sole architect of an arrangement involving an internationally significant child. Can you identify who, in the period between October 1981 and the commencement of this inquiry, held independent oversight authority over your choices in this matter?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The quality of his silence was the quality of a man identifying the exact weight of a question. "I exercised my own oversight," he said. "I reviewed my choices as circumstances developed. I sought counsel when I judged it appropriate." "From whom?" Another pause, shorter. "From persons I trusted." "Persons you had selected," the panelist said. "Yes," Dumbledore said, "and who had no formal independent standing." "Formal independence is one model of oversight," Dumbledore said, with a care that indicated he understood exactly where this line of questioning was going. "It is not the only model. I have operated for decades within a framework of informal accountability that has served. The bond of blood," the panelist said, "is deteriorating at a rate our examiner describes as significantly in excess of what the design should produce. The cause of that deterioration has not been identified by you, despite your confirmed awareness of its existence. A secondary dark magical signature has been formally documented at the Scar site. This signature is unknown to the ICW, unknown to the British Ministry, and, by your own implicit acknowledgement in this proceeding, not fully understood by you. You have made yourself the sole custodian of a situation that now includes an unidentified dark magical presence in a child of 11. You have no accountability structure for your decisions about that child. You have, by holding the relevant offices and by designing the relevant arrangements yourself, made yourself not merely responsible but irreplaceable. If your judgment in this matter is wrong, there is no mechanism by which anyone else can correct it. Can you tell us who could have corrected you in the last 10 years if you had been wrong? The room was very quiet. Dumbledore looked at the table surface. The charms master, from his position at the far wall, watched the headmaster's hands. Still, entirely still, the hands of a man who had reached the end of his prepared account and was sitting with what was on the other side of it. "I cannot name such a person," Dumbledore said at last. "The dark signature," the panelist said. "You have told this panel you are not yet in a position to characterize it. Is that accurate?" "It is accurate," Dumbledore said. "I do not fully understand what it is. I have suspicions. I have worked within the constraints of what I knew with certainty and what I had only suspected, and I haven't acted on suspicion in the matter of the signature, because to act on unconfirmed suspicion regarding something of this weight seemed to me to carry its own risks." He paused. "I am aware that this argument has limitations." "We note your acknowledgement," the panelist said. "We note that the dark signature remains unclassified. We note that it has now been formally documented. For the record, are you withdrawing your position that this matter does not require external oversight?" Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. "I am not withdrawing any position," he said quietly. "I am acknowledging that the terms of the situation have changed." The panel recorded this. The session closed formally, and the room became a room again rather than a proceeding, people moving and speaking in the lower register of conversations that were adjacent to the official ones. The charms master stayed where he was until most of them had gone. He had not come here expecting to feel triumph, and he did not feel it. He had known this in advance. He had started this because a charm was failing, and a child might be in danger, and what had happened in this room was the correct institutional response to those facts, and it had produced nothing that resembled satisfaction. What he felt, watching Dumbledore gather his papers with the unhurried care of a man who would not be seen to hurry, was the weight of having done a necessary thing. Not good in the sense that felt good. Right in the sense that the alternative had not been supportable. He thought about Harry Potter, who was 11 years old and sitting somewhere in this building, doing whatever he did on an afternoon when no one was telling him what was happening around him. He thought about the dark signature, documented now, existing on paper in a formal ICW record, classified as unknown. It was still unknown. The documentation hadn't changed that. Harry still had whatever it was sitting in his scar, and the bond of blood was still deteriorating, and the thing Dumbledore suspected, but had not confirmed, was still unconfirmed. He had done what could be done. The rest was what came next. The days shortened toward December, with the particular determination of a Scottish winter that had made up its mind. The investigation was ongoing. The ICW observer had not departed when the panel concluded its formal session, because the formal session had been one part of a larger inquiry whose remaining portions required instruments and proximity, and the instruments were still positioned throughout the school, monitoring with the patient precision of things designed to wait. Dumbledore had given permission for this. He had given it with the cooperation of a man who understood that refusing would cost him more than permitting, and the instruments sat in the corridors and stairwells with an unobtrusiveness that was partly their design and partly the fact that 11-year-olds in a magical castle were confronted daily with things that seemed strange and had learned to treat strangeness as the baseline. The charms master had maintained a habit of reviewing the instrument readings each morning before his first class. He had begun this informally, then continued it because the data was useful, and because the observer had suggested it in terms that implied professional collaboration between equals, which he had found he respected. On the first Monday in December, the 6th of the month, which was notable to him only because it was the day Hagrid had accepted a birthday cake from the first-year Gryffindors, with the embarrassed pleasure of a man not accustomed to being celebrated, which the charms master had witnessed from across the entrance hall, the readings changed. Not all of them. Not in a general way. One instrument, positioned at the charms master's suggestion in the third-floor corridor, at the end nearest the staircase, had begun registering differently. The difference was quantitative at first, a density increase in the ambient reading, and had become, over the course of that day and the following one, something qualitative, something that required him to look at the readout more than once, and then to set it down and go and find the observer. They compared the third-floor readings to the data from Harry's examination. The charms master had been expecting a resemblance of some kind. The Quidditch match data had established that the bond of blood responded sharply when a significant dark source came into proximity, and proximity implied there was a source to be proximate to. He had been expecting a directional correlation, something that suggested the third-floor corridor was closer to the stressor than other parts of the castle. He had not been expecting the structural match. The dark signature the third-floor instrument was reading was not merely similar to the unclassified residue at Harry's scar. It was the same signature type, same construction, same density profile, same absence of any analogue in either his professional catalogue or the ICW's formal registry. Concentrated, far more concentrated than what appeared in the scar, where it existed as a residue, a trace. Here it was present as a source, a dense, active, localized presence. "It is the same," the observer said, and set the comparison charts down on the table between them, with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something breakable. "Yes," the charms master said, "the deterioration of the bond of blood." The observer looked at the tracking records they had maintained since the examination. The acceleration has been consistent with the source location. When the chart is overlaid with proximity data, the source at the third floor, Harry Potter's position in the school at various points, the correlation is visible. The closer he has been to the third floor, the sharper the deterioration rate. "I had noticed the Quidditch match produced the sharpest spike," the charms master said. "The pitch is at some distance from the third floor, but the match was held during a period when the rate was already elevated. I attributed it to direct magical contest." He paused. "I may have underweighted the proximity factor. The Quidditch pitch is closer to the third floor than the Gryffindor common room," the observer said. "And the staircase Harry uses most frequently passes that corridor at a distance of approximately 20 feet. They were quiet for a moment. "There is something on the third floor." There was, the charms master noted with the particular internal adjustment of someone revising an earlier assessment, also the matter of the Forbidden Forest. Reports of unicorn deaths had reached the staff in the ordinary way of such things, through Hagrid initially, whose role as gamekeeper made the forest's disturbances his professional concern, and through the deputy headmistress's subsequent communication to staff that certain parts of the forest were to be avoided after dark until further notice. Unicorns were not prey animals in any conventional sense. Nothing that fed ordinarily on forest creatures would take a unicorn. The charms master had filed this as a separate anomaly, and had not, until this morning, connected it to the investigation. "Unicorn blood," he said. The observer looked at him. "It is theoretically capable of sustaining a very weakened living thing," he said. as a temporary measure. Cursed and at an ethical cost, the cost of which is, the literature is specific on this point, severe and lasting, but capable of sustaining something that would otherwise be unable to remain present in the physical world. He thought about the signature on the 3rd floor, dense and active and present in a way that the scar's residue was not, present like something that was currently alive, or maintaining something sufficiently close to life that the instruments measured it as a continuous source. If what we are reading on the 3rd floor is the same entity whose residue appears in the scar, and the structural match suggests it is, then it is not dormant. It is sustained. Something is feeding it, something that can be found in the forbidden forest. The observer was very still for a moment. "We need to take this to Dumbledore," they said. They presented their findings to the headmaster that afternoon. Dumbledore listened to the full account with the attention that never varied, complete, unreadable, the attention of a man absorbing information he was simultaneously processing at several levels. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the instrument methodology. He asked nothing about the unicorn blood inference. That told the charms master something. When the presentation concluded, Dumbledore said, with the even composure of someone who had already been sitting with this knowledge, "I appreciate the rigor of your analysis. I will need a day to consider the appropriate next steps," the observer said, with professional firmness. "I would ask for no more than that. This constitutes an active dark presence within a school building. The timeline for a formal escalation—" "I understand the timeline," Dumbledore said. 24 hours. He sent for Snape when they had gone. Snape arrived at the headmaster's office in the December dark, at an hour when the corridors were mostly empty and the torches had settled into their low winter burn. He had known Voldemort was somewhere in the castle since the start of term feast, had known it the way a man who had served under someone knew them even when they were concealed, even when they were diminished to a fraction of what they had been. He had not said so. Saying so would have required explaining how he knew, and explaining how he knew would have required a conversation Dumbledore had not, in their 30 years of uneasy professional proximity, initiated, and which Snape was not going to initiate himself. "The ICW instruments have detected a dark presence on the 3rd floor, Dumbledore said. Snape said nothing. "I believe you have been aware of something of this nature since the beginning of term," Dumbledore said, with the quiet directness of a man who had decided the indirect approach had reached its useful limit. Snape said, after a pause that was shorter than he would have preferred, "I had suspicions." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I thought you might." He looked at Snape with the expression that Snape had spent years trying to read and had never conclusively interpreted, the expression that was either trust or the very skillful performance of it. "I am not going to ask you how you formed them. I am going to ask for your help." The torches in the corridor outside were down to their winter low, and the school was quiet above them, in the way a school at night was quiet. Not empty of life, but composed of it, breath and sleep and the ordinary sounds of a building that had been a building for centuries. Snape, 31 years old and turning 32 in January, sat in the chair across from the headmaster's desk and thought about a girl with green eyes who had told him to be careful and who had not, herself, been careful enough. "Tell me what you need," he said. The trapdoor was heavier than Harry had expected, and the dark beneath it was absolute until the devil's snare came alive and wrapped itself around his ankles and began to pull him down into something that was not darkness but growth, vast and reaching and impersonal about it. And the only thing that mattered in the first 30 seconds was not panicking. He did not panic. He went slack, and the plant was confused by slackness, and that bought him time to think, and thinking was what he had. It was what he had always had. Ron fell through ahead of him and Hermione behind, and they moved through the chambers below the trap-door with the concentrated urgency of people who understood that speed mattered, and that understanding did not require them to discuss it. The Keys chamber required a broom, and he had been on a broom since September, and the one he found was responsive, and the key he found was old and fast, and he caught it. Wizard's chess was Ron's, and Ron knew it without being told, took the knight square with the particular calm of someone who had been trained from childhood in a game that cost something and paid what it cost, and Harry watched the White Queen's piece take him with a force that put him on the floor and tried not to look at what his face looked like. "Go," Ron said, from the floor. He went. What he did not know, going through the black flame alone, was that the instrument in the third-floor corridor had registered an absence. A sudden, total absence where the dark presence had been, as though the source had not diminished but relocated, downward. The observer had been at their station, understood the reading within 30 seconds, and gone directly to Dumbledore. Dumbledore had listened to 4 words and stood up from his desk, and the 3 of them had descended through the castle with a speed that was not quite running, but was not anything else. The room with the bottles was Hermione's. She worked it in a silence that was pure concentration, lips moving over the logic, and pointed at the smallest bottle. He drank it. The cold moved through him like something final, and the black flame ahead of him opened, and he walked through it alone. The mirror of Erised stood in the chamber beyond, as though it had been there always, tall and ornate and impossible feeling in the way that very old magic felt impossible, not threatening but vast. The Dada professor stood before it, and he had been expecting someone, but the way a person in a corridor expected the sound of footsteps and was still startled by them. Harry stopped in the entrance, and the Dada professor turned. "I wondered who would come," the professor said, in his characteristic stammer, which was present even now and even here, and Harry thought, this is not someone who is afraid. This is someone performing fear as a habit, so old it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He did not have a plan. He had himself, and a clear door at his back, and the understanding that whatever happened next was what happened next. The Dada professor told him to give him the stone. Harry looked at the mirror, at the reflection that showed a boy with green eyes pulling a red stone from his pocket, at the weight that appeared in his own pocket in the next moment that should not have been there. He understood, dimly, that this was how the mirror worked, that Dumbledore had made it work this way, that the stone appeared because he wanted to find it and not to use it, and he said nothing and did not move. The Dada professor reached for him. His hands caught Harry's wrists, and Harry's scar ignited. Not pain in the ordinary sense, pain as a structural event, as though something in the deepest layer of him was reacting to something in the deepest layer of the Dada professor, recognizing it or being recognized by it in a way that produced agony as a byproduct of the contact. He heard himself cry out. He heard the Dada professor cry out too, a different sound entirely, a sound of shock and damage, and the grip on his wrists released. "I cannot. He burns!" The voice from the back of the professor's head was thin and high and carried the quality of something that had been very powerful and had been reduced to a remainder. And it said, "Then use the mirror. Force him to give it to you. Do not touch him again." Harry looked at the purple turban that covered the back of the Dada professor's head, and he understood in the way that understanding arrived in the middle of things, what it concealed. "He is here," a voice said from behind him, and he turned to see the charms master and the ICW observer in the entrance to the chamber, both of them stopped by the same thing he had stopped at, both of them taking in the mirror and the Dada professor and the stone and Harry with the composite attention of people who had not expected to arrive in time to see this, and had arrived anyway. Dumbledore came through the entrance behind them and stopped and looked at the Dada professor with an expression that Harry would later think of as recognition, the particular expression of a man who had known something for a long time and had arrived at the moment of seeing it with his eyes. "Remove the turban," the thin voice said, and it was not asking the professor. It was instructing him. The Dada professor's hands moved to the back of his own head with the mechanical compliance of someone who had long since surrendered the decision-making to whatever shared the space with him. The turban fell. The face that looked out from the back of his head was barely a face, white and flat and snub-nosed, and somehow assembled from the idea of a face rather than the constituent parts, with red eyes that had no warmth in them, and no warmth had ever passed through. "Albus," the thing said. It was not greeting. It was inventory. "Tom," Dumbledore said, quietly. The ICW observer did not speak. They were watching with the complete and total attention of someone whose professional training had prepared them for many categories of unusual magical encounter, and had not prepared them for this one. They were watching the face on the back of the Dada professor's head, and their right hand had moved to the instrument at their belt, and they were making a record. The matter of Voldemort's survival had been officially treated as settled for 10 years. It was no longer settled. An ICW-accredited observer had witnessed it, and witnessed things could not be made provisional again. The Dada professor came at Harry again. Whether it was an order or a decision, Harry could not have said, but the motion was committed, and he had a fraction of a second to meet it or not. He put his hands up. The Dada professor's face came within reach, and he grabbed it, both palms, instinct and desperation, simultaneously, and the sound that came from the professor at that contact was not the sound of a person. It was the sound of something ending. Lily's protection was not comfortable. It was not warm. It was the specific, burning result of a love that had been absolute enough to make a permanent thing of itself, and it worked through Harry's hands and into the Dada professor with the implacable persistence of deep magic that had been waiting since October 1981 for the contact it was made to answer. The Dada professor crumpled. The face on the back of his head tore loose. Harry felt it more than saw it, felt the presence that had been sharing the room detach from the body it had occupied, and come apart into the air and then away through the ceiling and the stones and the darkness above, diminishing as it went and still not entirely gone. A high, thin sound receded. The room was quiet. The Dada professor was on the floor. Harry stood where he was, his hands burning, his scar burning, his whole head a single sustained note of pain, and looked at the charms master and the observer and Dumbledore, and felt distantly that there was something important about the fact that they were all in this room together at this moment, and that he would understand what it was later, when later existed. Snape came through the entrance last. He had no reason to be there that he would have described to anyone in the room, and he did not try to describe it. He looked at the floor where the Dada professor lay, and at Harry standing above him, and he said nothing, and his face did not move, and the charms master, watching from the wall, thought that Snape's capacity for remaining still in the face of things he had clearly expected and still not been prepared for was one of the more remarkable qualities the man possessed. Harry looked at Snape, He looked at Dumbledore. He looked at his hands, which had stopped burning, but still held the memory of what they had done. His scar was a sustained white pain behind his eyes. Then the floor came up, and the last thing he saw was the mirror, which was reflecting something he couldn't see before the dark arrived. And then there was nothing. He woke to white. White ceiling, white curtains, white light coming through high windows with the particular quality of light that arrived in rooms where people were meant to recover. He knew before he moved that his hands were bandaged. He knew before he opened his eyes fully that someone was sitting beside the bed, because he had always been a light sleeper, and the particular quality of attended quiet was one he could feel even before he was properly conscious. "Don't rush," Dumbledore said. Harry didn't rush. He lay still and let the ceiling resolve itself into something definite, and then turned his head. Dumbledore sat in the chair beside the bed with his hands in his lap, and his half-moon spectacles slightly off-center in the way they often were, as though they kept sliding down while he wasn't thinking about them, and he was looking at Harry with an expression that was different from the expression he usually wore. Less composed, in a way that was not quite vulnerability, but was adjacent to it. Less carefully arranged. "How do you feel?" he said. Harry considered this with the thoroughness it deserved. His hands were bandaged. His head ached with a low, residual persistence that was not quite the burning he remembered from the mirror chamber, but was its aftermath. His scar was quiet for the first time in months. "All right," he said. "Mostly." "That seems accurate," Dumbledore said, which was not entirely reassuring, but had the quality of honesty that Harry had learned to notice and to value. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, the kind of pause that preceded something being said that had been decided upon before the conversation started. "I want to tell you something about your mother," Dumbledore said. Harry waited. "Lily Potter was exceptional, a word I use carefully, having taught a great many people. She understood magic in a way very few ever have, not as a set of techniques to be mastered, but as something living, something that responded to the truth of who you were and what you were willing to give." He stopped for a moment. The night she died, she refused to move aside. She could have. She was given the opportunity. She chose not to. And in choosing not to, she made something that no countercurse and no hex and no dark magic has ever been able to unmake. She put herself between you and something that should have been impossible to survive, and because of who she was and how completely she meant it, you survived it. Harry did not speak. He was watching Dumbledore's face and thinking that this was the most direct thing any adult had said to him about what he was since he had arrived in the wizarding world, and it was still not quite the full truth, and he did not know what the full truth was, but he could feel the edges of what was being left out in the same way he could feel the shape of a room in the dark. "The protection she created is real," Dumbledore continued. "It held. What happened last night happened because it held, when it was tested by the thing that originally tried to kill you." He looked at Harry steadily. "That is what I wanted to tell you, that she did something extraordinary, and that it worked, and that you are here." "What about the other thing?" Harry said. "In my scar." The thing the observer found. A pause, shorter than Harry expected. "That," Dumbledore said, "is something I am still working to understand. I will tell you more when I have more to tell you. I give you my word that I intend to tell you, and that I am not asking you to wait indefinitely." He held Harry's gaze. "I am asking you to trust that I am working on it with all the urgency I have." Harry thought about this for a moment. He thought about trust, and about what it meant from a man who was very intelligent and who had, for reasons he had believed were good, kept a great many things from a great many people for a very long time. "All right," he said. And then, because it was true, "Thank you for what you just told me." Hagrid came in the afternoon with a box of chocolate frogs that had partially melted en route, though the frogs themselves were unimpressed by this, and one immediately launched itself off the bedside table. He sat on the visitor's chair with the air of a man who was aware the chair was unlikely to survive the encounter, and had decided not to think about it. He had been crying recently. He made no mention of it. "You all right?" he said, in a voice that was several volumes too large for the space, and deeply, genuinely meant. "I'm fine," Harry said. And then, because Hagrid's enormousness and his obvious emotion and the chocolate frog problem had combined to produce in him something that felt very nearly like laughter. Mostly. Hagrid's great hands wrapped briefly around Harry's bandaged ones and retreated, too careful to squeeze. He talked for a while about nothing in particular. His pumpkins, the Forbidden Forest being cleaner now. He could feel it. Harry let the sound of him fill the room and thought that this, the warmth of someone whose love was entirely uncomplicated and entirely without agenda, was the thing he hadn't known to want and would have found it very hard to live without. The formal report was filed within the week. Voldemort had been confirmed to exist in some form on British soil as recently as late 1991, housed within the body of a Hogwarts employee, a fact that retroactively revised the last 10 years of wizarding life from settled peace into a grace period during which no one had known what they were in. The Ministry was furious. An ICW investigation had been conducted on British soil without cooperation or notification, and the report constituted an international document describing a domestic situation the Ministry had classified as resolved. The Minister for Magic's displeasure was described in the ICW's correspondence log as emphatic. The recommendation regarding Harry's protection was equally clear. The bond of blood had deteriorated under the proximity of the very threat it was designed to counter. An alternative arrangement must be designed for the following summer with oversight. The bond would not be renewed as it was. In Hogwarts, the Charms Master received no formal thanks. He had not expected any. The school was adjusting to the political consequences of an earthquake he had started, and the adjusting was not smooth, and he taught his classes and corrected wand grips and did what he had always done. He had done what a person with his expertise and his position was obligated to do when a charm was failing and a child might be in danger. He had ensured the dark signature in Harry's scar was documented, which meant it was known, which meant it could eventually, by someone with more information and more time, be understood. It was what you could do. It was not always the same as what needed to be done, but it was a start. Dumbledore and Snape were observed in a corridor near the headmaster's office on an evening in June, speaking in the quiet voices of people who were not trying to be overheard. No third party was present. What could be read from a distance. Snape spoke first, which was unusual. Dumbledore listened without the slight movements that characterized his usual act of listening. When Dumbledore replied, Snape's posture changed in a way that was too small and too complex to interpret. Snape left first. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Harry was discharged from the hospital wing on a Tuesday. His hands were healed. His scar felt different, quieter than it had been all year, without the low, continuous hum of proximity to something large and dark that he hadn't, he now realized, understood was what he had been feeling since September. He hadn't known there was a baseline to compare it to, until the comparison became possible. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower through the late afternoon corridors and thought about his mother. He thought about a woman he had no memory of, who had understood magic in a way that very few people did, who had refused to move aside, who had left something in him that had held when it was tested. He had learned this from an adult who had not told him everything. He thought he understood why not, and he thought he would probably feel differently about why not when he was older, and he thought that was also fine for now. His scar prickled once, lightly, in the way it sometimes did for no reason he could identify. He reached up and touched it with the tips of his fingers. His mother's mark, the only thing of hers he'd ever had, and then took his hand away and kept walking. There was something else in there, something she hadn't put there. He didn't know what it was yet.